Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ipsos MORI's event on the US presidential election. What next? We've just over 2 weeks to go until the US presidential elections, and it has been quite a run-up. We've never seen quite a roller coaster like this in the run-up to a US election for many, many times now. We've put together a fantastic panel of speakers to talk through what some of the, not just what the latest polling is saying, but also what the impacts will be of whatever the outcome is in only a matter of weeks' time. So what happens under a Biden presidency? Does anything change if Trump wins again? And also, what happens if there's a tie and nobody wins? All this answered and more by our fantastic lineup. So firstly, we're going to hear from my colleague, Cliff Young. Cliff leads the public affairs business in the UK, in the US. He's the president of PA there. Before that, he was the managing director in Ipsos Brazil. He holds several roles at different academic institutes, also on public opinion polling and election forecasting, including Johns Hopkins, Columbia University, and the University of Sao Paulo. So after he's finished briefing us on what the latest polling data says, we will hear firstly from Sir Simon Fraser. Sir Simon is the co-founder of Flint Global, former head of the UK Foreign Office and Diplomatic Service. Between 2010 and 2015, he was head of the UK Foreign Office and the Diplomatic Service there. He's been a senior policy advisor to the British Foreign Secretary, ran a global network of embassies, and sat in the National Security Council. Before that, as the Permanent Secretary, he led the UK's Department for Business through the immediate aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. He's going to have lots of insights for us, not just on the impact on foreign policy, but also on UK trade and industry. Then next, we're going to hear from Duncan Edwards. Duncan's the Chief Executive of British American Business, the leading transatlantic trade organisation. Over 450 companies which seek to support and promote policies to enhance the environment for trade and investment between the US and the UK. Duncan is British, but he lives in New York, and he's been the chief executive of BAB since around 2018. And then finally, we're going to hear from Yasmeen Serhan, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic in London, and she's been in that role since around 2017. She comments and writes on a broad range of topics, including populism, nationalism, global protest movements, but also specifically relating to this on transatlantic affairs. She's previously an assistant editor and editorial fellow at The Atlantic in Washington. She joined us what seems like a lifetime ago back in February, where we had another event on the US election. And so I'm sure she'll comment on the changing dynamics between February and today. Who would have ever thought we'd be in the position we are now? So if you want to send any questions into the panelists, please do send them in the right-hand column just on your screens, and we will come to those at the end. But then I'll just hand over to Cliff, who will walk us through the latest polling. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning here in the US. We're going to spend about 15 minutes just me laying out the data, giving you context and grounding as to how we see the election at this point. As Kelly was saying, it's a roller coaster. I'd say a roller coaster of emotions, because for the most part, the data itself has been quite stable. I'll come back to that a bit, but that's truly a function of our highly polarized, crystallized times. Next slide, please. And so very quickly, what I really want to do initially is focus on the context of the election. We always like to begin by asking, what is this election about? To understand it, to provide meaning to it, to understand how voters are reflecting. And after that, we'll go into more detail about the more electoral metrics. Next slide. So very quickly, I mean, we can't get around it. It is about the coronavirus. This is just some concrete statistics on the coronavirus. We're going through what looks like another surge in the United States. We've sort of put the data at the national level as well as at some of the state levels. These are states in the West. This is what basically is defining who we are at this point of time, who we are as Americans, obviously who we are as global citizens. What we'll see is data that shows that you can't get around the coronavirus. It is what's defining voters' view of the world, whether they love or hate him. They are actually giving positive or negative points to the Trump administration when it confronts this. They're evaluating Biden as he details his message and his plan for government. You can't get around it. So the first and foremost, it's about coronavirus. coronavirus, and we'll come back and see more detailed data. Next slide. The other point, obviously, is the link between the pandemic on the one hand and the decline in the economy on the other. This is just taking, since 2010, our consumer confidence time series, where we basically tracked it monthly. We went to a weekly tracking when the pandemic, somewhere in March, I believe, we went to a weekly dip to understand how things were evolving. What I want to point out here is sort of, one important point. There is partisanship when it comes to even the economy. Obviously, the economy from a consumer confidence standpoint took a hit. We have historic jobless claims in the United States. But depending on whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have very different views of the economy. The Democrats are much more pessimistic than our Republicans. I point this out because many of us analysts at the beginning of the pandemic really thought the economy was going to implode, that this was going to undermine Trump considerably, because economics is the most strongly correlated of factors when it comes to electoral outcomes. That has not happened. Obviously, it's winnowed away his advantage in part on the margins, but there is partisanship when it comes to economics, very unique and very differentiated and different relative to past times. We'll come back and talk about that. Next slide. Here I want to say not only is it coronavirus, partisan economics, but the way we receive our news in the United States is very, very different. If you're a Democrat, you're receiving your news from one set of sources. If you're a Republican, a very different set of sources. You can see sort of when it comes to the coronavirus, whether you believe the death toll is exaggerated, whether you approve of Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. You can see that not only do Republicans have a very different view than independents, and Democrats, they're receiving their information from very different sources. So the most traditional juxtaposition is Fox News on the one hand for Republicans, NBC, MSNBC, and CNN on the other for Democrats. Again, in a very highly partisan times, we're experiencing the economic woes and the pandemic in very, very different ways. Next slide. And lastly, that said, even though we are experiencing in the United States the pandemic and the economic downturn in very different ways, as I was stating, we all see this election as a battle for the soul of America. This was sort of the opening volley by Biden at the convention. We just basically took that statement, pinched it, and tested it. And what we can see is, while we have across probably every policy domain, every social domain that we have at this point, that we've tracked at this point from a polling perspective, huge partisan differences. When it comes to the battle for the soul of the nation, there is no partisan difference. Everyone agrees. However, the question obviously is, how do you define the soul of the nation? What is the soul of the nation? And obviously the two sides are defining it as we speak today. Next slide. That's the context. Coronavirus, economic woes, there's partisanship. Seeing the world in very different ways, receiving information from very different ways, but it's a battle for the soul of America. Let's look at some key indicators. This goes back to my initial point. This is Trump's approval rating. He's at 40%. Doesn't put him at the high level when compared to other presidents, but it doesn't put him at the lowest level. He's still above 40%. He still has shown stability. That's a function, once again, of a highly partisan tribal times. You're either with him or you're against him. You love him or hate him, and that doesn't change much, even the pandemic itself. Next slide. We want to also say that in many of the key swing states, and we'll come back and talk about that, in the United States, it's not about the popular vote. It's about 50 state elections. The most important swing states, in our opinion, are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. There's a few more. We'll come back and talk. The point being is, he's doing relatively well in many of these key swing states. We have a very simple rule at Ipsos based upon a database of 1,000 elections around the world. A sitting president, better than 40% approval rating, Trump's at 42, has a better than 50-50 chance of winning. That doesn't mean he's in a dominant position, That doesn't mean that's the only indicator we use, which isn't the case. We use a lot of other indicators, which I'll talk about. But contrary to what many would have thought, Trump is not dead in the water. He's very much still viable, and we'll come back and talk about that. Next slide. Lastly, as I said before, on the one hand, he's been able to maintain certain stability when it comes to his approval ratings. He's still fairly strong in key swing states. He's weak on the coronavirus. And so we're going to see a couple of slides, a couple of the following slides showing just the importance of the coronavirus, how likely people think the vaccine will happen. That's been very important leading up the election. He's been promising the American populace there would be a solution. He's seen that as his elixir, as his October surprise, some way to change the agenda. And what we see is very few people, only 37% of Americans believe that that's likely to happen, and they're likely to take it. Indeed, what I wanted to point out from a credibility standpoint, Trump is less credible on a vaccine. You're less likely to take a vaccine if Trump is recommending it than paying $100. Obviously, your personal doctor is the most credible at 62%. The point being is the battle right now in terms of meaning is about the coronavirus. Who owns that? What we'll see in a bit is Biden owns the coronavirus. Trump is in a very difficult position. It's not unassailable or a position where he can overcome it, but he's still in a very difficult position. Next slide. So once again, I've repeated this over and over again. What we like to do is understand what is this election about. We know contextually it's about the coronavirus, the economy, and a couple other things. We typically mix and match aspirational questions with policy questions. What are the key issues? We have Americans rank order it, and then we've been tracking it over time. The number one issue at 29% when considering a president, when considering this election, is having a robust plan for the coronavirus. Biden has a 9-point lead there. The point is, this is a national poll. We're going to also see in the key swing states that Biden leads that. Trump leads on things like law and order and the economy, but those aren't the key issues still. So this is the consideration set. This is the context. Again, it's about the coronavirus. Trump is trailing on the coronavirus at this point. He's tried to downplay the coronavirus over the course of the campaign, upplaying the economy. When he contracted the virus, he tried to make over himself into a credible messenger on the coronavirus. But heretofore, it's been very difficult. We'll come back around and discuss what he's trying to do now. Next slide. Here, just once again, showing at the national level, a lot of stability. Biden showing a 10-point lead at the national level in our horse race poll. This is very analogous or very sort of aligned with the rest of the market, but we have to be careful in the United States. It's not about a popular vote. It's about 50 state elections. Next slide, please. And here I've already showed this slide a bit, looking at the approval ratings, but this upper hand portion, blue, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that's the Midwest. By the way, I am originally from the Midwest, from Chicago. This is the key battleground area. Trump took Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016, which sealed the deal for him. He needs to do the same there. We can see across the board in these key swing states, he's leading. That is, Biden is leading and has been consistently over time. Next slide. We kind of lay this out. This is a lot of data, a lot of blah, 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 blah. All we want to show, if you look across the key swing states as we define them, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, we see on average that Biden's leading over Trump. Whether we take the market average from places like 538, we take our own Ipsos Reuters polling, we show that. That should give some sort of solace, especially only 3 weeks out. This is when, 2 weeks out, this is when the polls really start to matter. But the one caveat I'll give is that Clinton was in the same place in these same swing states with the same margin of advantage in 2016. That's something that should give us pause. Next slide. And finally, kind of putting all this together, a poll is not a forecast. A poll is a snapshot in time. We've seen overall that the context doesn't favor Trump on the one hand. The polls have consistently at the national level and at the key swing state level have trended Biden. That said, Trump's approval ratings, which go into some of our econometric models, blah, 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 kind of statistical thing, but very sort of concrete, important inputs. Trump is leading on that. So we have mixed signals. The next slide. On the one hand, looking at across experts, we have one expert giving it to Trump, all the experts giving it to Biden. Okay. Experts are what? Maybe, you have to be careful. Here is another way to look at it. This is taking a series of different inputs. So our polling estimates, base rate is more of an econometric model using approval ratings. The main issue heuristic, which I talked about, who's leading on the main issue? Biden's leading on the main issue, which is coronavirus. We know based upon a database of 1,000+ elections around the world that the candidate that wins on the main issue on election day or leads on the main issue on election day wins the election 85% of the time. So it's a key input. We have fundraising here. We have social sentiment, that is social media analysis. We're just looking at different indicators. And overall, across at the national level and at the state level, we see things trending Biden, but there's still sort of, in our opinion, there are still toss-ups in Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin seem to be more strongly trending toward Biden. That said, and I think it's very important to sort of state, there are mixed signals. So the polling and the main issues on the one hand favor Biden. The base rate or the approval ratings on the other give some sort of advantage to Trump. There are some close heats, states like Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, and we should all sort of understand this uncertainty at this point. Next slide. So sort of summing it all up as we see it today, I would say the distribution of possible outcomes ranges from a Biden blowout to a slight Trump victory. The reality is somewhere at those endpoints or somewhere in the middle. It's a very difficult election to call, as we understand. I think we probably in the Q&A will talk about hidden Trump voters and things we might be missing. I think our fear is turnout. This is not an election about persuading people. It's an election about getting the base out. This is what the Trump campaign is really doing at this point. But once again, it'll be some sort of outcome between a slight Trump victory to a Biden blowout. That's at least what we feel today. The last point I'm going to make is when we're looking at election night, really look at Florida, because if Florida goes Biden early, it's a done deal that night. If not, we're going to go long into the night, long into the weeks, which we can talk about ultimately in the Q&A as well. And at that, I just to sum up, it's about the coronavirus, a little bit about the economy. Biden's winning on the coronavirus. Biden's leading in the horse race polls, but the fundamentals or the base rate model favor Trump because of his approval ratings and his incumbency. You put that all together, it looks like it's trending Biden, but there's a lot of uncertainty, especially as it comes to turnout. So at that, I'll hand it back over to Kelly and crew.
Thank you, Cliff. Absolutely brilliant. And it doesn't seem quite as clear-cut as some of the international press may make it seem. And the world is obviously watching what goes on in the election in America. And we asked the British public, actually, just in the run-up to the weekend, what they thought of potential outcomes would mean for the UK. And just 3 key takeaways from that before we go into the panelist discussion. Half of Britons think Donald Trump being re-elected would have a negative impact on the UK's relationship with the US. By contrast, 46% think that the election of a Joe Biden would be the outcome most suited to the UK's interest. And then the third point, a quarter of British people believe that we won't get a good trade deal from the US, regardless of who wins the presidency. So not a lot of optimism there. So without further ado, I thought we could go straight in and hear from Simon. Simon, would you just give some of your reflections on what you've heard, but also what you think some of the implications from the outcomes could be for the UK?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Kelly. What I've heard didn't surprise me. Nobody is going to stick their neck out at this point, I think. But clearly there is a trend towards Biden, or there has been a trend towards Biden, which we've all been watching with interest. I mean, what I'd like to talk about very briefly is some of the international implications of that from the British and broader perspective. I guess the first thing to say is, does it really matter who's in the White House? I mean, after all, we put a lot of focus on individuals, but what they do is shaped by events. American presidents since in recent years, there's been a lot of continuity, bipartisan continuity in their international policy positions. As I said, they were shaped by events. Clinton's hand was forced in the Balkans. G.W. Bush obviously was affected very much by 9/11 and the consequences. Obama was a primarily domestic president, but heavily influenced by the experience of Iraq. But broadly, those people all shared a belief in American leadership and America's vocation in the world and engagement with Western allies. Now, why this does matter, in my view, is because Trump has been fundamentally different. He has been outside that tradition. He doesn't seem to grasp the concept of the common good or of America's international vocation in the way that other presidents have. He has behaved as a sort of impulsive provocateur on several occasions. That doesn't mean that everything he's done is bad. I think he's read the mood on China correctly. You may disagree with how he's handled it, but he has shifted that in the right direction. But I do think he's damaged the integrity and the stability of systems of international cooperation and the broad alliance of democracies. And although the US system has mitigated that to some extent, he's also eroded the capability of the institutions of the United States in foreign policy. So that's why I think he's different. Some people may say it doesn't matter. Some people may very well much welcome what he's done. But for me, 4 more years of those behaviors could have very damaging consequences, I think. The context is incredibly demanding. We have geopolitical challenges from China, most notably from Russia. We have the issues like Iran in the Middle East that have to be handled. And we have huge global challenges around climate change, sustainability, reordering the model of international trade, regulating new technologies, preparing for new pandemics. And I just feel that with Trump in power, we will see further fracturing of the key relationships and structures, and therefore poor outcomes on those things. So what about Biden? Well, I think Biden would represent a reversion towards the norm that we have understood in the past, in understanding the role and the responsibilities of the United States. I think basically Biden would be unexciting but reassuring for most of America's allies. But I think we need to be careful about 2 things in particular. First of all, if we think there's going to be a wholesale realignment of American policy, foreign policy under Biden, I think we're wrong. Because he's going to have to deal with the same facts, the same domestic pressures on COVID, on inequality in American society, on racial tension within America, on economic dislocation. Those are all going to remain. And so is the tougher and more confrontational relationship with China. And I don't know how the Biden team are going to play China. It's a very interesting issue we can discuss. And also, there is no mood in America for expansive United States internationalism. So, a sea change in American policy is not on the cards. And that's the first thing. The second thing for America's allies is we must avoid complacency. If we think there's going to be a sort of automatic click back to the sort of relationships we had before, that is not right. America's allies are going to need to prove their relevance and value on today's issues, notably China, to a Biden administration. But I do think a Biden administration would be an opportunity to recalibrate the relationships, I think they would change significantly on some issues, notably climate. And I think the default setting would be to work with major European powers, the European Union, and the members of NATO, although the pressure on burden sharing would still be there in NATO. My very final word, if I may, on the United Kingdom. It was interesting what you said about that. I think for the UK, we need to distinguish between two things here. The overall interests of the United Kingdom as a Western democracy, and a narrow interpretation of the United Kingdom's so-called special relationship with the United States. And I think my own view is a Biden victory would be in the interest of the United Kingdom for all the reasons that I have described so far. But it will be problematic also for the United Kingdom because there are plenty of people in and around this government in the UK who would prefer Trump. They came in on the wave of Brexit. Brexit was born in 2016 at the same time as the Trump phenomenon. Johnson has a good relationship with Trump, whereas this government is not very well aligned or in tune with Biden. Biden has not favoured Brexit. He certainly wouldn't favour, I think, a no-deal Brexit. I think he's more likely to look to Paris and Berlin for partnership in Europe. And of course, Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, that whole agenda is going to be very important. So, there's a difference between the bilateral relationship and the national interest, which we need to explore. And finally, I think there's a huge amount of mythology on this question of a UK-US trade deal. I mean, we already have a pretty open trading relationship. A formal FTA between the UK and the US is more for me a matter of political symbolism than actual serious economic significance. And the British government's own figures bear that out. I think personally, if anything, it's less likely with a Democrat administration, given the complexities around Ireland and given the fact that I don't think Biden's going to be looking to do the UK many favors, frankly. And on top of that, if you have the Republicans still controlling the Senate, you've got another layer of complexity. So I don't think there are no easy outcomes on that one. I'll stop it there.
From the side of it, Simon, there are no easy outcomes for the UK either way. Whoever's elected in the US, really helpful. And I think what's also interesting, just the point you made about the political preferences from our current government, we also see that in the voter view as well. So when we looked at some of the results on who would be more supportive and think a Trump presidency would be more favourable, more Conservative voters believe that's the case, and again, more Labour voters believing Biden would be a more favourable outcome. So that split carries right through to the voters as well as obviously the political establishment.
Yes, but if you look at just one point on voters overall, even amongst the Conservatives, I think the majority in the end came out in favour of Biden being marginally a better outcome for the UK in your survey, which was interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. Really helpful. So we move on to Duncan now. Thanks, Duncan.
Yes, well, thank you, Kelly. Very interesting to listen to Simon's comments, much of which I agree with. Just to give you a bit of context about the organisation that I lead, British American Business, we are the American Chamber of Commerce in the UK, and we're also the British Chamber of Commerce in the US. So we represent companies that are active in and between both the US and the UK, and try to take an objective view about what's good for the corridor itself rather than for one side or the other. And we come at those at our policy positions and our thinking from a pro-business, pro-trade, open markets kind of point of view. So we have no political affiliations other than to recognize what's good for trade and investment, whichever party it comes from. So that's the background. I'm also not going to make any predictions at all because it's a bit of a mug's game. I remember before I actually was the CEO of BAB, I was on its advisory board, and this group met in both 2015 and 2016, and around the table were a number of pollsters, former cabinet ministers from both the US and the UK, business leaders. And in 2015, the consensus was a Labour win in the UK just before the election. And in 2016, the consensus around the table was that Brexit was unthinkable, and as was the election of Donald Trump. So experts and polls and wherever they may come from are a little bit unreliable, and I think we all understand that. So we've obviously talked to our members throughout the last 4 years about the Trump presidency, and I think what I hear more often than not is the need, or whether it's a need, but the tendency for people to separate, if you like, the presentation layer of Trump, which many people find very difficult and odious in some ways, and disruptive, and all the things that we know about, from the policy layer. And whether you agree or not with the policies, they are cogent, they hang together, they are a point of view. And in general, for corporate America, it's been certainly a good 3 years up until March. Corporate America was doing well out of the Trump policies. I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was very important for corporate America. US corporation tax at 35% was miles out of line with the norm in the Western world, which is why you were seeing all those inversions of companies relocating to Ireland at 13%. And so that was a good thing, and it was good for American employment. It was good for repatriating a huge amount of capital as well. So I think that was the signature issue. Throughout the period, there's also been a lot of deregulation or removal of regulation, which has been helpful to business. And of course, we've seen a 45% increase in the value of equity markets, which has helped businesses, of course, as well as in the US, most people have to fund their own retirement. So 401ks have also done extremely well for the average American over the last 4 years. So I think in general, whilst most people won't go on the record, I think that corporate America has been pretty supportive of the Trump policy approach. And again, without going on the record, most of them don't want to go on the record, have found it helpful. Same with the approach to trade policy. I think a more robust approach to trade policy was welcomed, particularly against China, who, if you've ever done any business in China, have cheated egregiously over the last 15 years. So this was broadly welcomed, and I think, as Simon says, is now accepted as a bipartisan issue. But I think also the sort of more robust attitude towards trade in general has not been condemned by business as much as perhaps people may think. The US arguably has had a rough deal under the settlement that created WTO and GATT, and we can go into from the changeover from GATT, and we can go into why if you would like me to. So whilst people broadly agree with the idea of an international rules-based order, the problem arises when the rules need to change, and if you can't change those rules through those institutions, it becomes very difficult if you feel you've been hard done by, rightly or wrongly. So I think just to talk a little bit about the potential outcome, I think if there's a Biden win, as Simon said, I don't think there'll be a huge amount of change unless it's a blowout and they win the Senate. I think there's quite a lot of nervousness about from corporate America about a win that wins the White House, the House, and the Senate. I think that's the proposed increase of corporation tax to 28% could easily become higher. And personal income tax and other issues. I know people who are looking at potentially 65% personal income tax if you live in New York City. That's going to have an effect. I agree that there wouldn't be much change on some of the big international issues like China. I think if anything, trade policy under a Biden administration would be more protectionist. He's talked very at length about making sure all government spending contracts are won by American companies with American workers, which is a bit problematic if you believe in free trade. And I completely agree with Simon that it wouldn't be good for a UK free trade deal. I mean, Joe Biden is a self-proclaimed Irish Catholic. pro-EU and with the sort of general protectionist tendencies of the left. So it would be, I think, it would be very difficult for a UK trade agreement, for whatever it's worth. I mean, I think it's worth a little bit more than Simon says, but I agree it's not a game changer. I think in general, finally, business would prefer a narrow win either way. I think the checks and balances of the US government are helpful to prevent kind of extreme policies being put into place either way. So maybe I'll stop there and can pick it up on the Q&A.
Fantastic, thanks, Duncan. Really useful to get the views from corporate America and a little bit about that narrow win point. We might come back to that in some of the Q&As. Thank you. Yasmeen, may I hand over to you for your reflections?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And as Kelly mentioned, I had the distinct honor of joining Ipsos back in February to chat about the forthcoming election. And it's kind of mind-blowing to think about how much has changed, not least the fact that, we were all in a room in person. As I recall, no one really kind of had any awareness of the coronavirus or R rates or things like that. And the only stockpiling that I think people were talking about up to that point was regarding Brexit. So things have changed quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, at one point that I will raise that I kind of just thought was interesting is that I've thought back to that panel quite a lot over the last 8 months, because there was one question that had come up from one audience member, effectively asking the panel if there's anything that could happen that would potentially undermine that incumbent's advantage that Cliff had mentioned in his presentation. And I believe I answered no. Which just goes to show why you should not make predictions about anything, including elections, but with grains of salt, of course. But yeah, obviously, and I think, my fellow panelists have done a good job, and Cliff as well, of noting all the kind of the things that have changed since then, not least a global public health crisis that, has infected 8 million Americans alone and has caused the deaths of more than 200,000, which are just, numbers that are really quite difficult to comprehend. But yet to the point that my fellow panelists make, I agree that certainly, I think it's right that we shouldn't expect too much of a foreign policy change. If there were to be a change in administration, I think what we would probably expect to see is obviously a different tone. I think certainly something that the UK has experienced, but also other US allies, is that this Trump administration is quite transactional in the way it approaches things. There's a lot of personality politics that goes on. And, we've seen Trump sort of kind of buddy up with sort of untraditional figures, I guess would be the most diplomatic way to put it. But whereas I think a Biden administration would certainly, I think, try to return to something of a more normal diplomatic relationship with a lot of its partners. But I think it would also try to be a bit more multilateral. I think the Biden administration points to the fact that, the US has sort of taken a step back on the world stage, whether that's its participation in various agreements or in multilateral institutions. I think Biden will want to bring the US back to that sort of thing. But rather than kind of talk about Trump or Biden, and I kind of want to focus on sort of the three factors that I think make this election particularly different. And the first goes without saying is the fact that this one is being held amidst a global public health crisis, the likes of which we really haven't seen in modern times. And not only is that just big because it's the biggest issue, as Cliff was saying, in terms of leading into this campaign, but it's also fundamentally changing the way American voters vote. A lot of American voters, large swathes of them, are voting by mail for the first time. I've been doing it for a couple of years now, and I've already done it for this one. But it's not the way a lot of American voters traditionally vote. And this also means that as a result, we have to contend with what we anticipate to be a massive influx of mail-in voting. The reason that this is complicated is because it brings us to the next factor, which I think is crucial, is that this election could take a lot longer to determine than previous elections. I think we're all pretty accustomed to, and I imagine people in the UK kind of are familiar with this as well, that, election day happens, you kind of get the returns over the course of the evening after the polls close, and then more or less by the end of the night in the US to the early morning, you have a semblance of who wins. I would caution against having that expectation this time around, if for no other reason than the fact that due to the pandemic, due to the changed ways that people are voting, it could take longer to sort of verify and finalize all those results. I think there's a concern about this sort of thing taking longer, though, because I think one of the issues with this election that's quite striking is that this is an election in which I think under half of Americans believe it will not be simple, easy, or easy, free, or fair, as I saw one poll put it. And that's quite concerning, because you take into account the fact that this is also an election in which the incumbent hasn't confirmed whether he would accept an unfavorable result. So you combined a potential delayed result with the type of rhetoric, and also President Trump's unfounded claims that, there's mass voter rigging. It's worth noting here that the president himself was also voted by mail, and that this is something that many states do already. But those narratives matter, and it could contribute to a sense of unease. And this kind of brings to the third factor, which is, if kind of taking in all those other issues, if it is a close result, as we've just discussed that it could be, or indeed if it's a contested result, that this election could potentially pose a big challenge to kind of the health of American democracy, particularly if kind of the courts have to get involved, if there's civil unrest. These are all things that, I think a lot of people are bracing for. And it's probably a good time to plug my colleague Barton Gellman's incredible cover story on this issue in the November issue of The Atlantic, which is available online and in print right now, but which is very much worth reading and kind of sobering read indeed. But I think it's kind of just worth going into this election knowing that it's not going to be normal. You shouldn't expect to know the results right away. Just because you don't hear the results right away, or if it's a bit shifty, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong. But you obviously want to pay attention to the fact of how the different candidates use these narratives. I spoke to the head of the OECD, which is the international organization that monitors elections. So they've been monitoring U.S. elections since, I believe, 2002. And they told me that this is, they anticipate this to be the most challenging U.S. election of recent decades. And, it's not just international observers who are looking at this. The Carter Center in Atlanta, they observe elections overseas and have been doing so for years. This is the first time that they're turning their attention to home, not to observe the elections the traditional way, but to kind of, give voters access to resources, know how they should vote, and how to prepare for election night and what to expect with regard to when they should hear the results. So those are kind of factors that I think kind of two are bearing in mind. As for making any predictions, I'm going to join my panelists and not do so, because if I've learned any lessons from February, it would be not to do that.
Thank you very, very much, Yasmeen. Really useful, because actually we're getting a lot of questions through on the issue of what happens in a contested election, how likely is that, but also that question, which I think Duncan raised as well, around it being a race, and actually what does that mean for what happens afterwards? And I guess maybe, Cliff, can you give some views, first of all, on that? What happens if it's quite marginal either way, and views on how likely that is, perhaps, as well, and anything on the contested election, and then we'll open it up to others.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Well, I think there's 2 points in sort of response to Duncan's point. There's the business community wants divided government. And I think this is perhaps could be an entire panel on where the United States is going long term. I think increasingly the coalition of Christian conservatives and economic conservatives will become increasingly frayed and difficult. And that's something that was always possible in the status quo ante. I think increasingly so as the demographics shift as they are, that will be increasing a difficult coalition to have. We can talk about that in more detail. Let's talk about long-term trends and sort of ultimately where voters are falling. That's a problem, obviously, for stability and some sort of reasonable shifting back and forth of the pendulum between the two sides. As the social, people's social values and their economic values increasingly diverge, that's a problem. And that's something that's a governance issue, that's a consensus building issue that we're already seeing the problems now. And I think long term, that's an increasing problem and a problem for the business community, I think. On the contested election, yeah, that's the massive gorilla in the room, right? What I would say is the following. Let's look at Florida. If Florida goes Biden, I think that at least the concrete information coming out, the data will support a Biden victory, because it'll be very difficult for Trump. Has very few other paths. Obviously, the closer it is, the more contested it can be. Obviously, Trump is especially is the one sort of hammering down on sort of extreme or differentiated, not normal, atypical rhetoric. But what I want to say, and I just want to take this tact, and this is more, Cliff Young, not the pollster, but Cliff Young is the general analyst in American talking, and actually one who lived in Brazil and Latin America for 10 years, is that we have to be very careful about the rhetoric. Indeed, it is legitimate to contest an election in the courts. We have to understand that. It is legitimate to use legitimate means to question things, right? It's not illegitimate. And I say that because the rhetoric is extremely sort of problematic at this point on both sides. And indeed, if you look at the data itself, just as many Americans think a Trump administration wouldn't be legitimate as a Biden administration, which is interesting to me because it's not one-sided, the perception. And so hopefully cooler heads will prevail, even though certain actors aren't responsible. But we have to understand ultimately that there are many means within the rules of the game to deal with something, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, they are legitimate. And I'm not making this point because I think Yasmeen pointed out anything that wasn't reasonable. On the contrary, this is our worry in the United States. I just want to call for cooler heads to understand that this will be complicated. We have to understand that, and understand that contesting an election through the courts is actually legitimate.
Thanks, Cliff. And then Simon, just your reflections on that, perhaps particularly if there isn't a landslide Biden victory and it's more marginal than that, does that have any implications at all from what we might expect to see by way of a UK-US relationship?
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert on the US politics and how that's going to play out, but clearly, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was very close. None of us would, I think, and we've got a lot of experience of that. I remember the hanging chads quite clearly. So, but no, I think that the point for the international reaction, I mean, it would be difficult internationally if there's a long period of uncertainty. I mean, that does create, a vacuum, which is very difficult. And then, of course, you've got all the players like Russia and, possibly China and others who may take the opportunity of uncertainty in the United States to do things which could be problematic. So we've got to worry about that. I mean, in the long run, the British government and other governments will work with whoever is deemed to be the winner. And, then, of course, as others have pointed out, it will depend on the nature of the victory, the balance of powers in Congress and so forth. In the end, of course, what we want is clarity, I guess, whether whatever our personal preferences are, and we want an America that has a clear position on the world stage and behaves in relation to its partners in a way which allows those partners to work with it. So, for example, if you talk to my former colleagues in the Trade Department of the European Commission, they would say on China, we'd love to work with America on China. Getting China integrated properly into the WTO and the international trade system. But how can we do that with an American president who's at the same time slapping sanctions on the European Union? It makes it very difficult. So, clarity of result, and then consistency in approach and partnership is what we'll be looking for ideally. I think we're more likely to get that with the Biden administration than with the second-term Trump administration.
What do you think, Duncan? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, look, I think in some ways the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration wasn't so much a change in policy as it was a change in approach. I mean, the Obama administration had complained about China, for example, for years, for the whole of its 8 years. It had also complained about what it saw as the underfunding of defence by a lot of NATO members, and had been, Simon much closer to this than I've ever been. But the approach was, look, we'll do this diplomatically. We'll try to get this changed, through consensus and so on. And I think the underlying policy objectives are the same, but the approach has been completely different, of course, and it's been much more like a Manhattan real estate dealer, who has tried to push using all of the aggressive tactics, and which make it very different from what's gone before. And I suspect that what will happen is if Biden wins, then there'll be a reversion to the approach, but the policy objectives won't change. And I think some of the more aggressive tactics will stay in place on China in particular, because I think that's now a bipartisan issue. I suspect it'll be the same with NATO as well. I think the argument's been won that in the US at least, that countries, other member countries of NATO need to spend more on defense, and the same in Japan and in South Korea and so on. That argument, I think, has been won, whether you agree with it or not, and it probably wouldn't change. Look, I completely agree with Cliff about the process. My own view is if it's close, there will be court cases. Whoever's nominally ahead will litigate. Let's hope it's done quickly. I don't believe for a moment that once the litigation is over, the incumbent would try to stay. I mean, I just think that's fanciful, and both fanciful and impossible. So I don't think there's any risk that the working of US democracy won't ultimately prevail.
Well, we'll let all of you comment on some of those points in a second. We have a couple of questions just coming in from a gentleman called Duncan Richardson, from the head of global trade policy at the City of London Corporation. Duncan's asking what evolutions in the polling mean that we should listen to the polls more this time around, which is an interesting question, which I expect Cliff should answer. But also he's asking about digital and tech, which has driven a lot of US growth in the last decade. How would both candidates approach tech firms if elected, especially on tax? Some questions there that you might want to respond to. Cliff, would you like to go first on the polling question, and then perhaps we can open it up to some others? Why should we listen to the polls this time around?
Because the polls weren't really wrong last time as well. I mean, it's all about context and meaning. As an analyst, it's about understanding how you're gauging your thermometer within the context. Are you taking a temperature on Mars, or are you taking it on Earth? Whatever the reading is, you'll have a different interpretation. The polls were pretty much spot on at the national level in 2016. They fell down a little bit in the key swing states, but the polls were trending towards Trump in the last few days. Ultimately, I would say, my fundamental critique of 2016 was the way we framed the narrative, the understanding of what was happening, right? I think we made corrections of the polls from a technical standpoint. I think we do a much better job of going after non-urban, non-college educated whites, which we missed, probably a couple point bias. But more importantly, just as I laid out all those indicators, a poll is one among many in your toolbox of understanding what's going to happen in the election. I think we have a more complete understanding. It's a close election. It's trending Biden, but it's all within the margin. It's a highly polarized society. It's all about getting out your vote, and that's what Trump is focused on right now. And so I think that's the best we can say. That's not what we said in 2016. What we said in 2016 was he has a 75% chance of winning. He has a 90% chance of winning. He has Clinton had a 65% chance of winning. The point being is that's false precision. I think the way we're couching it, just not me, but the industry in general, is the way we should, which is it looks like it's trending Biden, but we have this uncertainty, and we laid out the uncertainty.
Thank you, Yasmeen. Do you have any thoughts on this at all, on the trusting of the polls?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think Cliff covered it well, and I should note that I completely agree with what he and Duncan said about the fact that the courts. certainly didn't mean to kind of imply that, you know, going to the courts. I mean, as I said, we've done this before, that's not legitimate. It completely is. I think it's just more the rhetoric and the response that will be interesting to follow. But yeah, I mean, as for polling, I think Cliff's the expert on this, but yeah, I mean, I just kind of take everything with sort of a grain of salt now, and recognizing the important point that I think Cliff raised in his presentation, that, you know, popularity does not equate victory. You know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016, but the U.S. system doesn't work that way. So it really does make sense to kind of focus on the Electoral College as well, and focus particularly on those key swing states, because that's where the decisions are really made.
And then, Duncan, just the question around digital and tech, and about the fact it's driven a lot of US growth in the last decade. How do you think, do you have views on that one, about how either candidate would deal with the sort of the tech firms, and especially on tax?
Well, I think that, I mean, there are two separate questions here. I mean, one is the how do you tax these kind of international companies, these global companies, in a way that doesn't disrupt other businesses, and it's extremely difficult. I mean, I think I mean, clearly the UK has introduced a digital services tax, which will tax the imputed profits of technology companies that are not incorporated in the UK for their economic activity in the UK, and it's very popular among, you know, polls amongst opinion groups as a very popular thing. I mean, we've argued against it because we think an international solution, a multinational solution, would be better. But I have to say, trying to write that international solution, which the OECD is trying to do at the moment, is extremely difficult. And you know, I think that the likelihood of success from the OECD is quite slim, which I regret. Having said that, I think, come what may, I think technology, giant tech companies in the UK are heading towards more regulation. I just think it's coming. I just think the from left and right, for different reasons, there is a growing kind of opinion that these things are getting too big. And so I'm not quite sure what that form of regulation might be. I think potentially under a Trump administration, removing the protection which says that these companies are not publishers and are not liable for the content that they publish, I think is, you know, possible. As an ex-media person, I'm you know, sometimes a bit sympathetic to that point of view. You know, under a Biden administration, much greater protection of personal privacy and data protection. I suspect, you know, making what's happened in California more of a federal law, perhaps. So I just think there's more. I do think there's regulation coming down the track. Eventually, the US does seem to recognize when they've got you know, trusts that need breaking, whether it be in oil companies 100 years ago or telecoms companies in the middle of the last century. And I suspect that may be coming down the track.
Okay, we have a question here on some of the US's relationships with international organizations. It says, Sir Simon mentioned Trump's disruptive impact on the international rule-based order and disruption of the norm. I think that's an actual quote. But Trump and many other Americans feel his institutions are not working for them. The US is seen to be carrying the can for the rest of NATO, etc. So they may not be so unnerved by Trump's disruption. What does the panel think of that? And that is from the managing director of the Ipsos business in Northern Ireland, actually, where I happen to be from. So that is a very important question to get an answer to. Simon, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, there are different aspects of this. I mean, there's one thing which is the United States' role in global multilateral organizations, UN bodies and other. Now, the United States has always had a slightly ambivalent attitude towards the UN. The United States has always resented the fact that it seems to pay a disproportionate amount of the costs. You know, and fair enough. On the other hand, it's a system which was fundamentally built by the United States and its allies in our own interest and to promote our values in the world. And I think that the United States, you know, underestimates at its own peril the value that it can get out of that system and the power that it can exert through that system if it wants to. And it's very interesting, actually, you know, the current Trump administration and the current British government, who you think might have a similar attitude on some of these things, are actually in a divergent path on this one. So if you look at the WHO, for example, the British government, if the US pulls out, the British government will end up being the biggest national contributor to the WHO. So we're taking a different posture there on this question about Chinese role and Chinese dominance in the WHO. It's a very interesting example of this thing. I would just say the US, I would like to see the US exerting the leadership which actually many other countries want the US to exert. But of course, the second part of this is about the responsibility of other countries to play their part. And there's no doubt that there is a problem of free riding, for example, around European defence, which, as others, Duncan and others have pointed out, needs to be addressed. And it's very, very difficult for the Europeans to increase their defence spending when actually public opinion doesn't necessarily support that. This is a big challenge. But we can't criticise the Americans, who have a big agenda, and by the way, an agenda which is shifting away from Europe in terms of its focus. If we want to remain democratic allies of the United States, we've got to find a way of, as I said earlier, being relevant to the United States on today's agenda. And a lot of that begins with and ends with the relationship with China and how we're going to position ourselves in that big geopolitical standoff, which we're now going into. The multilateral system should be part of the answer to that. And I'd rather see us solve that problem within a framework of rules than see the United States and China step outside that framework of rules and try to slug it out between them, because then we will all be losers.
Thanks, Simon. Yasmeen, do you have any particular thoughts on this issue as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly, you know, I think Sir Simon is right that, you know, particularly with regard to NATO, I mean, you know, Trump can claim victory in that he, you know, sort of kind of pushed and prodded to get some folks to, or some countries, I should say, to raise their defense spending. But I think indeed, you know, I was listening to some comments that were made by former Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and you know, he was talking about how, you know, I mean, obviously a Biden administration would very much seek to sort of patch up the US's role in multilateral institutions, but that it sees it as part of, you know, like when the US steps back, it gives room for others like Britain to step forward. But something that Blinken had said that I thought was interesting was that, you know, effectively that with regard to China in particular, that, you know, China was asserting its own leadership role in international institutions, and with the US abdicating its role, say, of the WHO, the WTO, and NATO, etc., that, you know, these could be avenues where other parties, including potential adversaries of the US, could step in. So I think it's kind of, you know, a deeply different view of how they see the US's role in the world. And indeed, Americans may well be, you know, disagree in that some believe that, you know, we should kind of just be looking more inward, that we needn't kind of focus. It's not our job to police the world, as some people say. And others think, no, you know, if we step back, then it allows others to step in. And, you know, we, you know, as Sir Simon said, we kind of helped create a lot of these institutions. We should have a say in you know, in leading them. So,
Thank you. And Duncan.
Yeah, I think there would be a difference in approach under a Biden administration. If you read the Democratic Party's platform, their version of a manifesto, you'll see it laid out pretty clearly that the Biden administration would rejoin the Paris Accord, would try to re-sign up to the JCPOA on Iran. I think that'd be a little bit more difficult because they'd have to prove that Iran is in compliance. They would rejoin UNESCO, the United Nations Human Rights Commission. At least that's what they say. Whereas, you know, America, as Simon said, has always been a bit kind of iffy about supranational organizations, particularly when it kind of infringes, as they all do a little bit, on sovereignty, and anything that infringes on the sort of the supremacy of the Supreme Court in jurisprudence is always a very difficult thing. You know, the Supreme Court is iconic here, and anything that says some sort of international court or arbitration has, you know, can overrule the Supreme Court is, you know, I think an impossible sell inside the US. Yeah, so there would be a different approach, you know, and certainly nicer at the conferences and the G7s and G20s. I think everyone would rub along a lot better than they have done for the last 4 years, that's for sure. None of those awkward photographs or sniggering at Buckingham Palace or whatever there was.
Thank you, Duncan. So now I'm just going to group 3 questions together, and then you can respond to whatever you want, and this will be the last round. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So the first question, which is really, I think this one's, Cliff, this is one solely directed at you, really. Why is Texas leaning away from Trump? Well, how can you explain that? And then how do you explain that shift? And then one question quite broadly on Brexit. And given the announcements last week, we should be preparing for a no-deal scenario. What will a Brexit no deal mean under either a Trump or Biden? And then one broad question on China. Trump's had somewhat of an on-again, off-again relationship with China, but to what extent do you think that the US relationship with China, either under Trump or Biden, will influence UK relations with China? So a little bit about Europe, a little bit about China, and then a very detail-orientated question about why is Texas leaning away from Trump? Where will we start? Will we clear the Texas thing up, Cliff, and then we can go to Simon and just work around the screen?
Okay, I can go first. We don't know if it's trending away from Trump or leaning away from Trump yet. I mean, we've had some polls there as of late that don't favor him as well, that it's trending more Biden. It's not a Biden state. And so we don't know. We'll see on election day. We'll see how things unfold the next couple of weeks. Could it be a leading indicator of a complete implosion or the ebbs and flows of polls? We're not quite sure. I think long-term, Texas is going to be increasingly difficult for Republicans as the demographics change there, as the urban areas become very important. I think key to this election, we didn't talk about it, were the suburban areas, which are typically moderate Republican bastions or redoubts. Trump's lost ground there. That doesn't mean necessarily they've permanently migrated to the Democratic Party. That might be a part what we're seeing in the big urban areas in Texas. But I think it's a long-term trend, 2 or 3 cycles. That's not to say it couldn't go Biden this iteration, but I think probably it stays red, though trending blue in the long term.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to take your pick?
Well, on the Brexit question, I mean, I'm going to take a leaf out of Yasmeen's book and not make a prediction, but I am still expecting a Brexit deal myself, but let's see. I don't rule out the possibility of no deal. I think if Trump has won the election, then the British government will be less worried about no deal than if Biden has won the election. And I think if there is a no deal Brexit and Trump is in the White House, he'll try to be helpful to the British government, and therefore that may play into the trade deal politics as well. I think Biden, for the reasons that Beaver explained, would be antipathetic to a no deal Brexit. He would think it was not a sensible thing to do, and it would be sort of against the spirit of what we've been talking about the attitude that we expect the Biden administration to have towards regrouping the Democratic Alliance. He's talked about having this conference or this meeting of democracies next year, and I think a no-deal Brexit would leave the British looking pretty awkward, frankly, a little bit in that context. So let us see how it goes. But as I say, I'm hoping we'll still have a deal of some sort. Just very briefly on the China point, in a way that underlines the same question for the British. You know, we've been talking about 3 major economic relationships in recent years. The European one, which we're moving away from, or we are sort of introducing new potential obstacles into. The American one, which actually has been very unclear and uncertain under Trump, and has been the assumed relationship with the United States is in question. And then, of course, both the globalizers and the Brexiters cited China as the big opportunity a few years ago, and now we're seeing a change of posture on China, and this being played out in new restrictions on investment, the sort of force majeure of the United States on Huawei, for example. So the question that the British have got to work out is, where do we stand in these big relationships? And on China in particular, like other countries, where do we strike the balance between our concern over security issues, which are legitimate concerns, but our need for economic engagement and the economic opportunity that lies in China. Huge question.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks. Will we go to Duncan and then finish off with Yasmeen?
I'm not sure I've got anything to add on the Brexit question. I think we hope a Brexit deal will be done, and I think it will be. And I agree that if it isn't, then the UK will be better off with Trump in the White House than Biden if they want to get a trade agreement done. On China, I'm not sure I do agree. I think the UK and Europe need to, choose a side in a way. I think you're trying to draw some equivalence between the US and the US and China, which I've seen done time and time again. I just think is just wrong. I mean, on the one hand, you've got a fully functioning democracy. On the other hand, you've got, an autocracy with very limited personal freedoms and all the things we condemn in Belarus, for example, at the moment, but 1,000 times worse. And I think it's difficult to ride both horses, both the economic horse, about, well, we want to do business with these people, and the sort of moral horse. And I think it's quite difficult to do both. And I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to do both.
Interesting. Love to get you all in a room to talk about that more. But Yasmeen, just final reflections from you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say on kind of the US's stance towards China. I mean, I think there's kind of growing bipartisan support for kind of taking a tougher tack for a lot of, for a lot of the reasons I think Duncan was alluding to, vis-a-vis Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, etc. So not to mention trade, which of course is kind of Trump's main thing, but so I wouldn't expect kind of a loosening on that. I think just quickly on the trade deal, though, certainly Trump has obviously been a very vocal supporter of Brexit and has certainly kind of suggested he would be very amenable to a US-UK trade deal. I think it's kind of worth remembering that obviously Congress plays a role in this, and I think that's kind of just one difficulty that could still exist were Trump to be reelected. I mean, even though, Biden, as we've established, has kind of voiced his concerns about Northern Ireland, but Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has done the same, and has said previously on visits here and since that that would be an issue that they would take into account in trade negotiations. So unfortunately with trade deals, I mean, the US is a behemoth and difficult to trade with and make agreements with as it is, but the fact that you don't just have to deal with the White House, you have to deal with others as well, and many congressmen and women who obviously have their own interests of their constituents, and that brings in a whole boatload of issues like chlorinated chicken and many more.
Thank you very much. And it's just left for me to say thank you to everybody for contributing today. For those of you who are listening in, to Cliff for giving us a run through what the polling's saying at the minute and what some of the key decision points will be for the American electorate, to Simon, Yasmeen and Duncan as well for bringing their incredible perspectives. I think we have covered pretty much everything. So thank you all. Thank you for your time today. Have a lovely rest of day. Yes, and we will, I'm sure, talk about this again post-November. Take care. Bye.